He was patrolling a frozen lava field after a volcanic eruption and didn't expect to find anything unusual. But he noticed an old subway entrance. When the ranger went down and saw what was hidden below, he immediately called his superiors and requested backup. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The lava field stretched to the horizon like a frozen ocean, its surface locked in violent motion that had ended centuries too late. Black basalt rose and fell in hardened waves, sharp ridges catching the sun and reflecting it back in blinding flashes. Between those ridges lay shallow troughs filled with fine gray dust, remnants of ash ground down by decades of relentless wind. The air above the stone shimmered, bending the distance into a wavering illusion, as though the land itself refused to be seen clearly for too long. Nothing grew here. No shrubs clung to cracks. No insects skittered across the surface. Even birds avoided crossing this place, as if some instinct warned them that the ground below was hostile to life. The heat pressed down without mercy. Sunlight struck the dark rock and radiated upward, turning the air into a furnace that drained moisture from the body with every breath. Each step produced a faint crunch, not from sand, but from brittle fragments of volcanic glass that shattered under pressure. The smell was dry and metallic, a scent that seemed baked permanently into the stone. Sound behaved strangely in the open emptiness. Footsteps echoed too sharply and then vanished, swallowed by distance, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. This was not a place meant for people. It had no roads, no signs, no landmarks recognizable to anyone unfamiliar with its subtle patterns. To the untrained eye, every direction looked the same. To those who knew it well, the lava field was still dangerous, capable of breaking an ankle, tearing through boots, or disorienting even the most careful traveler. It was the kind of terrain that punished mistakes immediately and without apology. Jack Walker moved through it with deliberate care. He was a ranger assigned to one of the most remote districts under federal protection, a region that rarely appeared in reports unless something had gone wrong. Years of experience had taught him to respect land like this, to read the surface before committing his weight, to test each step before trusting it. His boots were scuffed and dusted white at the edges from dried ash. Sweat darkened the fabric of his uniform beneath his vest, though his movements remained steady and controlled. Patrols through the lava field were routine, but never casual. The area was officially closed to visitors, not because of any hidden secret, but because of the sheer risk it posed. Occasionally, illegal campers wandered too close to the perimeter. Sometimes smugglers attempted to cross the desert, believing its emptiness would protect them. Most of the time, though, the field remained untouched, an expanse of hostile geology that discouraged curiosity. Jack's task that day was simple. He was surveying a stretch of land flagged for periodic inspection, checking for signs of human intrusion or environmental disturbance. The route had been logged dozens of times before. Nothing new was expected. His handheld GPS unit confirmed his position, its signal stable for now, though he knew it could falter in places where the rock formations interfered with transmission. A radio hung from his shoulder, quiet except for the occasional burst of static that reminded him how far he was from the nearest station. The monotony of the patrol allowed his mind to settle into a rhythm. He scanned the ground ahead, noted changes in texture, marked minor shifts in elevation. The lava field was not entirely uniform. Some areas were smoother, where a molten rock had cooled slowly. Others were jagged and chaotic, frozen mid-eruption. The sun climbed higher, intensifying the heat, and Jack paused briefly to drink from his canteen, careful not to waste water. It was then that he noticed something wrong. At first, it was no more than a disruption in the pattern, a shape that did not conform to the natural flow of the stone. Far ahead, partially obscured by heat distortion, stood a vertical line where no vertical line should exist. The lava field was defined by curves, by organic violence turned solid. Straight edges were rare. Right angles almost non-existent. Jack stopped walking. He adjusted his stance and narrowed his eyes, focusing on the distant shape. The heat shimmer made it difficult to judge distance or size. It could have been a trick of light, a fragment of rock catching the sun at the wrong angle. He had seen mirages before, false silhouettes that vanished the closer one approached. Still, something about this was different. The line remained steady, unmoving, its outline refusing to dissolve into the surrounding chaos. He checked his bearings and compared the object's location to his map. There was nothing marked there. No old structures, no survey equipment, no historical sites. The land records described this area as untouched since the last volcanic activity, aside from modern patrol routes skirting its edges. Jack resumed walking, though more slowly now. As he advanced, the shape resolved itself with uncomfortable clarity. What had first appeared as a single line became several, parallel edges, a flat surface interrupting the uneven ground. The closer he came, the more the object asserted its presence, as though it had been waiting to be seen. Within a few dozen meters, doubt gave way to certainty. This was not natural. The structure rose from the lava like an artifact misplaced by time. Darkened metal jutted upward, its surface scarred and warped, edges softened as if they had once been exposed to extreme heat. Around its base, the lava appeared disturbed, as though it had flowed around the object rather than burying it completely. Ash and sand had accumulated in shallow drifts, partially concealing what looked like steps descending into the ground. Jack felt a tightening in his chest. Structures in this region were not just unusual, they were alarming. He circled the site carefully, keeping several meters of distance as he studied it from different angles. The object was not large, but it was unmistakably engineered. Straight lines intersected at precise angles. A railing, or what remained of one, curved downward beside the steps. Portions of the metal bore a dull sheen where corrosion had been slowed, suggesting that parts of the structure had been exposed and maintained, or at least protected from complete decay. The implications were troubling. If someone had built this here, it would have required resources, planning, and intent. If it was old, it should have been documented. If it was new, it should not have escaped detection in such a controlled zone. Jack crouched and brushed away a thin layer of ash near the top step. The surface beneath was smooth and unmistakably artificial. His fingers traced the edge of the material, feeling the coldness of metal beneath the sun's relentless heat. It was not a hatch or a simple access point. It was an entrance. A memory stirred at the back of his mind, an image from training manuals in distant cities he had visited long ago. The curve of the railing, the width of the steps. The proportions were wrong for a mine shaft or bunker. The realization settled slowly, reluctantly. It looked like the entrance to a subway station. The thought made no sense. There were no cities for hundreds of miles, no historical record of urban development anywhere near this desert. Subway systems belonged beneath streets, under concrete and crowds, not beneath lava and empty sky. Jack stood and scanned the surrounding landscape again, half expecting the structure to vanish, to reveal itself as some elaborate coincidence. The lava field remained silent and unchanged, The entrance remained where it was, stubbornly real. He keyed his radio, hesitated, then lowered his hand. Calling this in without understanding what he was looking at would raise questions he could not yet answer. Protocol demanded confirmation, assessment, evidence. He reached for his camera instead and documented the site from multiple angles, capturing the way the entrance cut into the volcanic terrain. As he did, another detail caught his attention. The metal along the upper edge of the entrance bore signs of intense thermal damage. It had blistered and sagged in places, frozen in shapes that suggested it had once been subjected to extreme heat from above. Lava heat. And yet, despite that, the structure had not collapsed. It had endured. That endurance unsettled him more than the entrance itself. Jack moved closer to the steps and peered downward. Darkness swallowed the stairwell after only a few meters. From below, a faint breath of cold air rose to meet the heat of the surface, creating a subtle, unnatural draft. It smelled of old concrete and something else, something sharper and more recent. He took a slow breath and felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was no forgotten debris or harmless anomaly. Whatever lay beneath the lava field had been built deliberately, had survived a volcanic event, and had remained hidden long enough to escape every record he knew. The desert around him remained still, indifferent to his discovery. Wind swept across the basalt, erasing distant footprints almost as quickly as they formed. Jack checked the ground near the entrance one last time before committing himself further. In the thin layer of dust at the edge of the top step, he saw a faint disturbance, a subtle scuff that did not match the random patterns of drifting ash. It was the mark of a boot, fresh enough to stand out, deliberate enough to point downward. Jack straightened slowly, his senses sharpening. The patrol had changed. The lava field was no longer just empty terrain, it was a threshold. He adjusted his gear, secured his flashlight, and took one final look at the endless black expanse stretching behind him. Then he turned back to the steps, aware that whatever waited below had already rewritten everything he thought he knew about this place. The faint boot mark at the edge of the top step lingered in Jack Walker's mind as he stood above the entrance, the heat of the lava field pressing against his back while cold air breathed steadily from below. The contrast was unsettling, as if two incompatible worlds were meeting at that narrow threshold. He did not descend immediately. Experience had taught him that the most dangerous mistakes were made in haste, especially in places where nothing was supposed to exist at all. He moved around the structure again, slower now, more methodical. With the sun nearly overhead, the entrance cast a short, sharp shadow that emphasized its geometry. The steps were wide and shallow, their proportions unmistakable once he allowed himself to accept the impossible. This was not a service hatch or a utility access. It was designed for steady human traffic, for hundreds of feet passing up and down every day. The idea felt absurd in the middle of a lava field that had likely killed everything in its path when it was born. Jack knelt and brushed more ash away with his gloved hand. Beneath the loose gray powder, the surface of the steps revealed a smoother layer, dulled by age but still intact. Along the sides, fragments of a railing emerged, warped and darkened, the metal twisted as if it had softened under intense heat and then hardened again in place. The lava had not simply buried this structure. It had flowed around it, licked at its edge and scarred it, and then moved on, leaving the entrance standing like a stubborn witness to catastrophe. He traced the railing downward with his eyes, noting where sections had been replaced. The newer metal was subtle but unmistakable. It was less corroded, the bolts tighter, the edges sharper. Someone had reinforced this entrance long after the lava cooled. That realization shifted the weight of the discovery. This was not just an artifact of some failed project from a distant era. It was something that had been touched, altered, and possibly used in recent time. Jack stood and scanned the surrounding terrain once more. The lava field offered no cover, no obvious vantage points, no clear paths leading toward the entrance. And yet, the faint scuff he had seen suggested someone had stood where he stood now, had chosen this precise route through the basalt. The wind moved steadily across the rock, carrying dust that softened the sharpest details, but it could not erase the sense that this place had been deliberately approached. He pulled his camera from his vest again and documented the newly revealed sections of the entrance, focusing on the junctions between old and new materials. Each photograph felt like an attempt to anchor the discovery in reality, to give it context that could be shared and understood later. Still, the images looked wrong even on the screen. A city relic framed by endless black stone and white sky. The cold air rising from below grew stronger as the sun heated the surface. It flowed upward in a steady current, brushing against Jack's legs, carrying with it the smell of damp concrete and aged metal. There was no odor of decay or stagnant water. Instead, the air felt circulated, as though the space below was not entirely sealed. That detail troubled him more than he expected. He tested the first step with his boot, applying pressure slowly. It held firm. He tested the second, then the third, listening for any shift or crack beneath his weight. The steps descended at a gentle angle, disappearing into shadow after several meters. The light from above faded quickly, swallowed by the structure's depth. Jack paused again, his hand hovering near the radio at his shoulder. He considered calling this in now, reporting an anomalous structure and requesting immediate support. Protocol allowed for discretion in initial assessments, but it also emphasized personal safety. If the entrance led to something dangerous or occupied, he would be alone and vulnerable. He lowered his hand. Not yet. Instead, he activated his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls lined with old tiles, their once bright surfaces dulled and cracked. Some tiles had fallen away entirely, exposing rough concrete beneath. Others bore faint traces of patterns, geometric designs that hinted at an aesthetic concern beyond pure utility. This was infrastructure meant to be seen, not hidden. As he descended further, the temperature dropped noticeably. The heat from the surface receded, replaced by a cool, stable chill that clung to his skin. The sound of his footsteps changed as well, echoing softly against the enclosed space. Each step seemed louder here, amplified by the narrow walls and low ceiling. Halfway down, Jack stopped and turned off his flashlight for a moment. Darkness closed in instantly, complete and absolute. He listened. There was no sound beyond his own breathing and the faint whisper of air moving upward. No machinery, no voices, no distant echoes of movement. And yet, the silence did not feel abandoned. It felt maintained. He switched the light back on and continued. The stairwell opened into a small landing, then continued downward again, turning slightly as it did. Along the wall, he noticed remnants of signage. The lettering was worn beyond recognition, but the shapes were familiar, the spacing deliberate. His mind filled in possibilities he did not want to entertain. Station names, directional guides, schedules. At the base of the stairs, the space widened abruptly. Jack stepped onto what could only be described as a platform. It stretched into the darkness on either side, its edges straight and precise. There were no tracks, but the grooves and mounting points where rails had once been secured were still visible, rusted and empty. The platform surface was layered with dust, thicker here than on the steps, suggesting that air movement was weaker at this depth. He swept the flashlight across the platform slowly, taking in every detail. Sections of the ceiling showed signs of stress, cracks branching outward like veins. In places, the concrete appeared melted and reformed, its surface rippled and uneven, a silent record of extreme heat passing overhead long ago. And yet, the structure held. The platform had not collapsed. It had endured. Jack crouched near the edge and examined the dust more closely. The surface was smooth in places, undisturbed. In others, it bore faint impressions. Footprints. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. They moved along the platform, then veered away from the open space toward a darker section at the far end. He followed them with his light. The prints were clear enough to distinguish tread patterns, the kind found on modern work boots. They were not centuries old. They were recent. The dust around them had not settled back into place, and there were no signs of erosion that would suggest significant time had passed. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with temperature. Jack stood slowly, his senses sharpening. The platform was no longer just an abandoned relic. It was a junction between eras, one that someone had reopened for a purpose that remained hidden. The thought of moving deeper into the structure carried a different weight now. This was not exploration for curiosity's sake. It was assessment under potential threat. He advanced along the platform, keeping close to the wall, his light angled to minimize reflection and glare. As he approached the area where the footprints converged, he noticed a service door set into the concrete. It was large and reinforced, its surface scarred but intact. The hinges bore scratches and wear that stood out against the surrounding decay. Someone had opened this door many times. Jack stopped a few steps away. The air here felt colder, heavier. A faint vibration hummed through the floor, so subtle it might have been imagined, but persistent enough to raise the hair on his arms. Whatever lay beyond that door was not simply empty space. He considered his options carefully. Retreat was still possible. He could leave now, secure the site from above, and report everything he had seen. But the footprints told a story that was still unfinished. If people were using this place, understanding how and why mattered. The location alone suggested intent. The maintenance suggested planning, and the depth suggested secrecy. Jack reached out and tested the door handle. It was cold to the touch, solid and locked. He withdrew his hand and stepped back, scanning the platform once more. The footprints did not stop at the door. They continued past it, fading into a side passage partially concealed by shadow and debris. That passage angled downward, away from the main platform, leading into a narrower tunnel that the flashlight barely penetrated. The entrance above him had been startling enough. This, however, was something else entirely. The structure was not just a single forgotten station, it was part of a network, one that extended deeper beneath the lava field than any surface observation could reveal. Jack took a deep breath and steadied himself. The desert above felt impossibly distant now, a hostile but familiar world compared to the unknown unfolding beneath his feet. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and stepped toward the side passage, aware that each step forward reduced his margin for error. The subway entrance in the lava field had been the anomaly. What lay beyond it was beginning to look like intent made solid, hidden beneath stone and time, waiting for the wrong person to walk too far. The side passage drew Jack Walker away from the open platform and into a narrower corridor where the architecture changed almost immediately. The space compressed around him, the walls closing in just enough to alter the acoustics of his movement. Each step now produced a dull, contained echo that seemed to linger longer than it should, as if the sound were reluctant to fade. The beam of his flashlight revealed concrete walls stained by time, their surfaces uneven where repairs had been attempted decades apart by different hands and for different purposes. The temperature continued to fall as he moved deeper. It was no longer simply cool, but distinctly cold, a steady chill that seeped through fabric and skin alike. The air here felt heavier, carrying a faint mineral scent mixed with something sharper and more mechanical. Jack recognized it immediately, not as a single smell but as a combination he had encountered before in old facilities that were supposed to be dead, but were not entirely forgotten. It was the smell of enclosed space that still breathed, that still exchanged air with the surface through hidden roots. The corridor widened gradually, opening into another platform-like area, smaller than the first but more intact. Here, the walls were covered almost entirely in tile. The flashlight glided across them, revealing muted colors and geometric patterns arranged with deliberate care. Time had dulled their vibrancy, but the craftsmanship remained evident. Some tiles were cracked or missing, exposing rough concrete beneath, yet others clung stubbornly to the wall, preserved by the stable underground climate. Jack slowed his pace, letting his eyes adjust and his mind absorb the implications. This was no hastily built structure. The tiled walls spoke of an era when public infrastructure was designed not only for function, but for permanence and presence. Whoever commissioned this place had expected it to be used, seen, and maintained. That expectation lingered in the architecture even after abandonment and catastrophe. He approached the wall and ran a gloved hand lightly over the tile surface. Dust coated it unevenly, thicker in recesses, thinner where something or someone had brushed past. The patterns themselves were familiar in a distant way, reminiscent of early 20th century transit stations he had seen in photographs and museums. There were no readable signs left, no names or directions, but the spacing of the empty mounting points suggested that signage had once been here, guiding passengers to destinations that no longer existed. The ceiling above told a darker story. In several places, the concrete appeared warped, as though it had softened under intense heat before hardening again. The flashlight revealed ripples frozen mid-motion, unnatural shapes that contrasted sharply with the straight lines of the original construction. Jack imagined the moment when lava or extreme heat had passed overhead, pressing down through layers of earth and stone, testing the limits of the structure. That it had survived at all was remarkable. That it had remained accessible was disturbing. As he moved farther along the platform, Jack noticed subtle differences in the dust patterns on the floor. Near the walls, the layer was thick and undisturbed, suggesting long periods of inactivity. Toward the center, however, the dust was thinner, broken by faint tracks and scuffs. These were not random. They formed paths, narrow lanes of movement that implied regular use. Someone knew where they were going here and walked the same routes repeatedly. He followed one such path toward the far end of the platform, his flashlight angled low to catch the slightest variation in the surface. The footprints became clearer as he advanced. They overlapped in places, suggesting multiple trips, multiple individuals. The tread patterns were modern, consistent with heavy-duty boots designed for work rather than casual travel. There was no attempt to conceal them, no effort to erase or scatter the dust afterward. Whoever moved through this space did not expect interruption. Jack paused and listened again. The silence persisted, but it was no longer empty. It was layered, dense with the sense of enclosed volume beyond immediate sight. The faint vibration he had felt earlier returned, more noticeable now that he stood still. It traveled through the soles of his boots and into his legs, a subtle hum that suggested distant machinery or airflow moving through unseen conduits. He continued toward the source of the footprints, passing beneath a section of ceiling where the tiles had fallen away entirely. The exposed concrete here was darker, stained by moisture that had seeped through microfractures over time. Drops of water clung to the surface, occasionally falling to the floor with soft, irregular taps. Each sound echoed briefly, then vanished. The path of footprints led him to a junction where the platform ended and the structure transitioned into a tunnel. The tunnel mouth was framed by reinforced concrete, its edges clean and precise compared to the surrounding decay. This was not a collapse or an improvised opening. It was an intentional passage, part of the original design, and yet it bore signs of modification. Newer materials had been added, strengthening the frame, smoothing rough sections, making the passage safer and more navigable. Jack stepped into the tunnel and felt the space narrow again. The walls here were closer, the ceiling lower. Pipes ran along one side, some old and corroded, others newer and secured with modern brackets. Electrical cables followed a similar pattern, old lines abandoned in place while newer ones were layered over them, feeding power deeper into the network. The presence of electricity, even indirectly implied, sharpened Jack's focus. Abandoned structures did not require power. Active ones did. He moved carefully, his flashlight tracing the lines of cables and pipes, noting where they disappeared into the walls or ceiling. The tunnel sloped gently downward, a gradual descent that would have been barely noticeable without careful attention. The temperature dropped another degree, enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. As he advanced, the air began to move more noticeably. It flowed past him in a steady current, cool and dry, suggesting a ventilation system operating somewhere ahead. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it the unmistakable implication of design and maintenance. Air did not circulate like this by accident. Jack stopped again, crouching low and turning off his flashlight. Darkness enveloped him instantly, complete and suffocating. He held his breath and listened, letting his senses adjust. The hum became more distinct in the absence of light, a low, constant presence that seemed to pulse faintly through the structure. There were no voices, no footsteps, no sudden sounds. Whatever activity existed here was either distant or temporarily paused. He turned the light back on and continued. The tunnel eventually opened into another space, smaller than the platform but clearly designated for a specific function. The walls here were bare concrete, unadorned and practical. The floor was cleaner, swept or worn smooth by repeated use. Against one wall stood a series of metal cabinets, their surfaces scratched and dented. Some were open, revealing empty shelves. Others were closed, secured with locks that showed signs of frequent handling. Jack approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of immediate danger. There were no tripwires, no obvious alarms, no signs that the space was actively monitored. Still, the sense of intrusion weighed heavily on him. He was no longer just discovering an anomaly. He was trespassing into a system that someone had invested time and effort to conceal. Near the far end of the room, he noticed a door partially concealed by a shadow cast from an overhead beam. Unlike the service door on the main platform, this one was smaller and less reinforced, but it was newer. The metal was cleaner, the hinges well oiled. The dust around it was disturbed, marked by overlapping footprints that converged and then diverged again. Jack's heart rate increased slightly as he studied the door. Everything he had seen so far pointed toward organized activity, not the random occupation of vagrants or the remnants of some forgotten operation. The structure beneath the lava field was being used deliberately and not sporadically. The modifications were too careful, the patterns too consistent. He stood slowly, adjusting his stance to reduce noise, and moved closer to the door. The air here was colder still, almost biting. The vibration underfoot intensified, no longer subtle enough to dismiss. It was steady, rhythmic, like the distant operation of machinery running continuously. Jack reached out and placed his hand against the wall beside the door. The concrete was cold, but beneath that cold he felt a faint warmth, localized and unnatural. Something on the other side of this wall was generating heat. He withdrew his hand and took a step back, reassessing. The deeper he went, the greater the risk. Yet every new detail reinforced the same conclusion. This was not merely an abandoned subway station uncovered by chance. It was a functioning node within a hidden network, one that extended beyond the boundaries of this single platform and tunnel. He turned his flashlight back toward the tunnel he had come from, memorizing the route, noting landmarks and variations in the walls. If he had to retreat quickly, he needed to know the path instinctively. The desert above felt impossibly far away now, separated by layers of rock, concrete, and history. Jack returned his attention to the door and the faint hum beyond it. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he recorded its location, photographed the surrounding area, and marked the point on his map. Evidence mattered. Context mattered. Whatever was happening here needed to be understood as part of a larger whole. As he prepared to move on, a thought crystallized in his mind with unsettling clarity. The original builders of this place had lost control of it to nature, their ambitions buried under lava and time. But someone else had found it again, recognized its potential, and adapted it to their own ends. They had not simply rediscovered history. They had repurposed it. Jack stepped away from the door and continued deeper along the tunnel, following the faint tracks and the pull of moving air. Each step carried him farther from the world above and closer to the heart of whatever had awakened beneath the lava field, waiting unseen until someone finally noticed that nothing here was exactly what it seemed. The tunnel carried Jack Walker away from the tiled remnants of the old station and into a space that felt increasingly divorced from anything meant for public use. The walls narrowed just enough to make the air feel heavier, as though the structure itself were pressing inward. The ceiling dipped lower, forcing him to angle his flashlight upward more often, checking for cracks, loose fragments, anything that might signal instability. Every sense he had was alert now, sharpened by the awareness that this place was not merely abandoned but quietly active in ways that refused to announce themselves openly. As he moved forward, the tunnel's character shifted subtly but unmistakably. The concrete here was older, rougher, poured in long sections that bore the faint seams of early industrial construction. Over those seams ran newer reinforcements, patches where the original surface had been cut away and replaced with smoother material. The difference in texture was visible even in low light. Someone had not simply maintained this tunnel. They had modified it with intention, strengthening certain points, widening others, correcting flaws left by the original builders. The floor sloped downward at a shallow angle, almost imperceptible unless one paid close attention. Jack did, counting his steps, measuring the descent by the pressure in his legs and the way the air grew cooler with each meter. His boots no longer kicked up thick dust. Instead, the surface beneath him felt worn, as though countless passes had polished it smooth. The sound of his footsteps changed accordingly, becoming softer, more muted, absorbed by the narrow passage. Along the right-hand wall, a series of pipes ran parallel to the tunnel. Some were ancient, their metal eaten away by corrosion, capped and abandoned in place. Others were newer, secured with modern brackets, their surfaces clean and intact. Electrical cables followed a similar pattern, layered atop one another like a timeline of use. The older lines sagged uselessly, while newer ones were taut, purposeful, disappearing into conduits that led deeper underground. Jack slowed, examining the cables closely. He did not need to touch them to understand what they implied. Power was being drawn from somewhere, fed through this tunnel to a destination not far ahead. The faint hum he had noticed earlier grew slightly stronger, no longer something he had to concentrate to perceive. It was a steady vibration, constant and disciplined, the sound of machinery that did not rely on chance. The realization made his throat tighten. This was no forgotten corridor rediscovered by accident. It was a route, a passage maintained and relied upon. He paused and turned off his flashlight again, standing perfectly still. In the darkness, the hum seemed to surround him, resonating faintly through the concrete. There were no other sounds, no voices, no footsteps, no metallic clatter. Whoever used this tunnel was not here now, or they were far enough away to remain unheard. The silence felt deliberate, like a held breath. When he turned the light back on, he noticed markings on the wall that he had missed before. They were subtle, almost invisible beneath layers of grime and age, but they followed a pattern. Small symbols etched or painted at intervals, some faded to near nothing, others reinforced with newer strokes. They were not decorative. They were functional, guiding movement, marking distances, identifying junctions known only to those who had learned to read them. The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into two narrower passages. One sloped upward slightly, its entrance partially blocked by debris and collapsed concrete. The other continued downward, its floor clear, its edges reinforced. The choice was obvious, and not because Jack wanted to go deeper. The footprints he had been following led unambiguously into the downward passage, their impressions overlapping and reinforcing one another as if to insist on the direction. He followed. The air changed again as he descended, becoming drier, cleaner, stripped of the musty undertones that usually characterize deep underground spaces. Ventilation grates appeared along the walls at regular intervals, some old and rusted, others newer and clearly functional. A faint current flowed steadily through them, drawing air from above and pushing it onward. The system was not powerful, but it was sufficient, designed to keep conditions stable rather than comfortable. Jack's sense of scale began to distort. The tunnel seemed to stretch longer than it should, bending gently, turning just enough to hide what lay ahead. His flashlight illuminated only a short segment at a time, and beyond that, the darkness remained impenetrable. He became acutely aware of how far he had traveled from the platform, how many turns he would have to retrace if he needed to retreat quickly. The walls here bore fewer marks of the original aesthetic. Gone were the tiles and decorative elements. This section had always been meant for maintenance, for access rather than display. Yet, even here, The craftsmanship of the early builders was evident in the precision of the concrete forms, the careful alignment of structural supports. The original project had been ambitious, thorough, and incomplete in a way that suggested it had been halted abruptly rather than abandoned gradually. Jack imagined the moment work had stopped, the sound of tools falling silent. The rush to evacuate as conditions above ground turned deadly. Plans left unfinished, corridors sealed or forgotten as lava consumed the surface. The tunnel around him felt like a remnant of that moment, frozen in time until someone else had found it. That someone else had done more than simply open old doors. As the tunnel widened slightly, Jack encountered a section where the original concrete had been cut away entirely. In its place stood a reinforced passage lined with modern materials, smooth and uniform, the edges sharp and precise. The transition between old and new was stark, impossible to miss. This was not a patch or repair. It was an expansion. The footprints on the floor grew more numerous here, overlapping into a chaotic pattern that suggested frequent traffic. Some impressions were heavier than others, as though the individuals moving through this space carried weight or pushed loads. Jack knelt and examined one section closely. There were faint parallel marks alongside the boot prints, subtle but consistent, as if small wheels had passed over the dust repeatedly. He straightened slowly, his mind assembling the pieces into a picture he did not like. Whatever lay ahead required transport, equipment, supplies, possibly something far heavier than a person. The tunnel continued, curving gently before opening into a larger junction. Here, multiple passages intersected, some branching off at shallow angles, others plunging deeper into darkness. Not all were in use. Several were blocked by collapses or deliberately sealed with concrete. Others showed clear signs of maintenance, their floors clean, their walls reinforced. Jack stood at the center of the junction, turning slowly, mapping the space in his mind. This was no single-purpose corridor. It was a network, or the remains of one, selectively revived and reshaped. Someone had chosen which paths to restore and which to abandon, guided by a plan that extended beyond what he could see. The hum was louder here, no longer subtle. It pulsed through the floor and walls, steady and persistent. Jack felt it in his chest as much as his feet. It came from one particular passage, a broad tunnel reinforced with thick supports and lined with newer cables and pipes. The airflow there was stronger, the air noticeably warmer, as though heat were being generated somewhere beyond. He hesitated at the threshold, weighing the risks with the calm detachment drilled into him over years of service. Going farther meant deeper commitment, greater danger, and fewer options for retreat. Yet turning back now would leave too much unanswered. He had already crossed the line between observation and involvement. The knowledge he carried was incomplete, and incomplete knowledge could be dangerous in its own right. Jack advanced into the reinforced tunnel. The walls here were clean, almost sterile compared to the rest of the structure. The floor was level, deliberately so, and bore the unmistakable marks of repeated heavy use. The air grew warmer with each step, the hum resolving into a more complex soundscape of distant machinery operating in harmony. Not loud, not chaotic, but methodical. As he moved, Jack noticed subtle indicators of organization. The cables were bundled neatly, secured at regular intervals. The pipes were labeled, their markings faint but consistent. This was not a temporary setup hastily thrown together. It was a system designed to function over time, to support sustained activity without drawing attention. The reinforced tunnel ended abruptly at a massive service door set into a concrete wall. The door dwarfed the others he had seen, its surface thick and scarred, reinforced with crossbars and heavy hinges. The floor before it was worn smooth, the dust pushed aside by constant traffic. The parallel wheel marks were most pronounced here, converging towards the door and disappearing beneath it. Jack stopped several meters short and scanned the area carefully. The hum was strongest here, accompanied by a faint vibration that traveled up his legs and into his spine. The air was noticeably warmer, tinged with the dry scent of metal and something else, something industrial and purposeful. He did not approach the door immediately. Instead, he studied its surroundings, noting the absence of obvious locking mechanisms and the presence of control panels mounted nearby. They were dark now, inactive or in standby, their surfaces smudged by frequent contact. The implication was clear. This door was opened and closed regularly, and not by accident. Jack took a step back, his instincts urging caution. He was standing at the threshold of something significant, something far larger than a single abandoned station or forgotten tunnel. The structure beneath the lava field extended farther than it ever should have, both physically and in purpose. It had grown beyond its origins, repurposed by people who understood its value as a hidden artery beneath hostile land. He reached for his camera again and documented the door, the markings, the floor, the cables feeding into the wall around it. Each image felt inadequate, a poor substitute for the scale and gravity of what he was witnessing. Still, evidence mattered. It was the thread that would connect his experience to the world above. As he finished, Jack allowed himself a moment to absorb the reality of the situation. He was deep underground, alone, standing before a sealed gateway that likely concealed the heart of an active operation. Whatever lay beyond that door was not meant to be found, and certainly not by a lone ranger on a routine patrol. The tunnel behind him stretched back into darkness, a long and winding path to the lava field and the open sky. For the first time since descending, Jack felt the weight of isolation press in fully. The desert above had been empty, but it had been honest. This place was hidden, layered, and deceptive. He remained still, listening to the hum, feeling the vibration, knowing that the next choice he made would define the rest of this discovery. Jack Walker stood before the massive service door longer than he realized, his breathing slow and controlled as he listened to the steady hum resonating through the concrete. The reinforced tunnel behind him felt like a narrowing throat, guiding everything towards this single point. Every cable, every pipe, every worn mark on the floor converged here with unmistakable intent. This was not simply another chamber along a forgotten route. This was a destination. He approached carefully, each step measured to avoid unnecessary noise. The air around the door was warmer, not uncomfortably so, but noticeably different from the chill of the tunnels behind him. It carried a dry, metallic scent layered with something faintly chemical, the kind of smell that lingered in facilities designed for storage and processing rather than transit. The vibration beneath his boots was no longer subtle. It pulsed with quiet regularity, like the distant heartbeat of a machine designed to run without interruption. Jack examined the door up close. Its surface was scarred but solid, the metal thick enough to withstand pressure and time. The hinges were oversized, reinforced with plates that suggested repeated opening and closing under significant load. There was no obvious locking mechanism in sight, no simple padlock or latch. Instead, a recessed panel sat to one side, its surface smudged with fingerprints and faint streaks of grime where gloved hands had brushed against it countless times. He did not touch it. Instead, Jack turned his attention to the floor. The dust here had been almost entirely cleared away, pushed aside by constant traffic. The concrete was polished smooth in places, worn down by the repeated passage of heavy objects. Parallel lines ran through the surface, unmistakable now that he stood so close. Wheels. Not small ones, not improvised carts, but something designed to carry weight efficiently over long distances. He followed those lines with his eyes as they disappeared beneath the door. The realization settled in with a quiet, creeping weight. Whatever lay beyond was not just stored here. It was moved, rotated, accessed. This was a working hub. Jack stepped back and swept his flashlight across the surrounding walls. The reinforced tunnel ended here, but smaller conduits branched off to either side, disappearing into the concrete. They carried cables, pipes, and ventilation ducts, all feeding into the space behind the door. The infrastructure was dense and layered, the result of multiple phases of construction and adaptation. The original builders had laid the foundation, but someone else had expanded it, feeding new systems into old bones. He documented everything methodically, photographing the door, the panel, the cable junctions, the floor markings. Each image felt like a fragment of a larger truth, one that was slowly assembling itself in his mind, whether he wanted it to or not. The scale of the operation suggested by this single junction was far beyond anything he had anticipated when he first noticed a strange shape in the lava field above. When he finished, Jack turned his attention back to the door and made a decision. He did not attempt to open it fully. That would be reckless, an invitation to whatever risks waited on the other side. Instead, he searched along the edges, testing seams and joints, looking for any indication of internal pressure or movement. His gloved hand brushed against the metal, feeling its temperature. It was slightly warm, not enough to burn, but enough to confirm that activity beyond the barrier was ongoing. He crouched and angled his flashlight toward the narrow gap at the base of the door. The beam slipped beneath, illuminating a thin strip of space on the other side. What it revealed made his breath catch despite his efforts to remain composed. Beyond the door stretched a vast interior, far larger than anything he had encountered so far. The floor extended into the distance, disappearing beyond the reach of his light. Rows of shapes rose from it in orderly lines, their silhouettes rigid and uniform. The faint glow of overhead lighting cast sharp, controlled shadows that spoke of deliberate arrangement rather than chaos. Jack adjusted the angle slightly, sweeping the light across one of the nearest shapes. It was a crate. Large, rectangular, reinforced with metal bands. Its surface was marked with symbols and codes that meant nothing to him at a glance, but were clearly intended to convey information to those who understood them. The crates were sealed, stacked with care, aligned with a precision that left no doubt about the discipline behind their placement. He shifted again, revealing more of the space. The crates stretched in rows, forming aisles wide enough for vehicles or heavy carts to pass through. Along the far wall, barely visible, stood equipment that hummed softly, likely generators or climate control systems designed to keep the environment stable. Ventilation ducts ran along the ceiling, distributing air evenly across the room. This was a warehouse. The implications hit him all at once. A warehouse hidden beneath a lava field, connected to a network of tunnels and platforms that had been deliberately restored and expanded. The isolation of the location, the thickness of the basalt above, the absence of surface indicators, all combined to create the perfect concealment. Thermal signatures would be muted. Aerial observation would reveal nothing but ancient stone and emptiness. Jack withdrew his light and remained crouched, his mind racing through possibilities. Whatever was stored here had been placed with intention and care. The level of organization ruled out opportunistic squatters or small-scale operations. This was something planned, funded, and maintained over time. He straightened slowly and scanned the chamber around the door once more, alert for any sign of movement. The hum continued, steady and unchanging. No footsteps approached. No voices carried through the ventilation. Either the facility was temporarily unoccupied, or its operators were elsewhere in the network, unaware of his presence. The temptation to open one of the crates, even partially, tugged at him with dangerous insistence. Confirmation mattered. Understanding what was being stored here would clarify everything. Yet he knew the risk. Opening a crate would mean crossing a line from observation into direct interference. It would leave evidence of his presence that could not be erased easily. He weighed the decision carefully, the discipline drilled into him over years of service asserting itself against curiosity. In the end, duty prevailed. Jack selected a crate positioned near the edge of the room, one that could be reached with minimal exposure if he lifted the door just enough to access it. He scanned the area one last time, then used his knife to carefully test the seal along the crate's lid. The material resisted at first, then yielded with a soft, controlled sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the vast space. He lifted the lid just enough to allow his flashlight beam to slip inside. The contents reflected the light back at him in cold, unforgiving shapes. Metallic surfaces. Dense, compact forms packed with precision. This was not raw material or harmless equipment. It was something designed for use, for deployment. The sheer quantity visible in that single crate suggested scale, repetition, and preparation. Jack closed the lid immediately, his pulse quickening despite his efforts to remain calm. He did not need to see more. The message was clear enough. This hidden node was not a relic. It was an operational hub supporting activities that had no place beneath protected land. Whatever organization controlled it had invested heavily in secrecy, infrastructure, and logistics. And now, by chance or fate, that secrecy had been breached. Jack backed away from the door, every sense attuned to the possibility that the situation could change without warning. He retraced his steps slowly, memorizing the path, marking mental reference points. The tunnel behind him no longer felt like a route of discovery. It felt like an escape corridor. As he moved away from the warehouse, the weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him with increasing urgency. This was no longer a matter for a single ranger to investigate. The scale of the operation demanded immediate action, coordination, and authority far beyond his own. The hidden node beneath the lava field had revealed itself just enough to expose its purpose. And that purpose carried consequences that reached far beyond the silent tunnels and frozen stone above. Jack Walker did not linger after sealing the crate again. The decision to stop was immediate and absolute, driven not by fear but by clarity. He had seen enough to understand the nature of what lay beneath the lava field, and more importantly, he understood what no longer belonged to him. This discovery had crossed the threshold where individual judgment ended and institutional response began. Every additional minute spent underground increased the risk of being discovered, trapped, or erased without explanation. He moved away from the massive door with deliberate care, placing each step where the floor had already been worn smooth by others. The hum behind him continued unchanged, indifferent to his presence or departure. That indifference was unsettling in its own way, a reminder that the operation concealed here did not rely on constant human supervision. It was designed to persist quietly, to function whether anyone watched it or not. As Jack retraced his path through the reinforced tunnel, the air seemed heavier than before, not because it had changed, but because his awareness of it had. Every vibration underfoot now carried meaning. Every cable overhead felt like a vein feeding a hidden body. He kept his flashlight angled low and forward, illuminating only what he needed to see, conserving both battery and attention. The tunnel junction loomed ahead, its branching passages now familiar enough to navigate without hesitation. Jack moved through it without stopping, choosing the route he had memorized, the one marked by overlapping footprints and subtle maintenance. His mind cataloged details automatically, distances, turns, changes in slope. If he had to describe this place later, he needed to do so accurately, efficiently, without embellishment or confusion. The faint sense of warmth faded as he moved farther from the warehouse node. The temperature dropped gradually, returning to the cold, dry stillness of the older sections of the tunnel. The hum softened but did not disappear entirely, receding into the background like a distant engine heard through layers of earth. It was a sound that would stay with him long after he left, he knew, a reminder of how close he had come to something far larger than himself. When he reached the narrower passage leading back toward the tiled station area, Jack paused briefly and turned off his flashlight once more. He stood in darkness, listening, letting his breathing slow. This time the silence felt different. Not empty, not maintained, but charged with possibility. He imagined footsteps echoing suddenly behind him, voices carried by the ventilation, a door opening where there had been none. Nothing happened. He turned the light back on and continued. The tiled platform came into view, its cracked surfaces and faded patterns almost comforting in their familiarity. This part of the structure felt older, less actively controlled. The footprints here were still visible, but they no longer multiplied or deepened. Whatever activity fed the warehouse node seemed to concentrate deeper within the network, leaving the station itself as little more than a transit point. Jack moved quickly now, though not recklessly. The need to leave had become urgent, a pressure building with each step upward toward the stairwell. He checked his radio as he walked, watching for signs of returning signal. Static greeted him at first, then a faint response, broken and unreliable. He adjusted his position, holding the device higher, turning slightly, searching for a point where transmission might break through the layers of stone and concrete. At the base of the stairwell, he stopped again and keyed the radio, speaking briefly and clearly. His words were concise, stripped of speculation, focused on facts. He transmitted coordinates, described the entrance, the depth, the extent of the tunnels, and the existence of a large underground storage area with clear signs of recent and ongoing use. He emphasized scale, organization, and concealment. He requested immediate escalation and advised against sending a lone responder. The reply came in fragments, but enough reached him to confirm that he had been heard. Instructions followed, equally brief. Maintain distance. Do not re-enter. Secure the area from above if possible. Additional units were being notified. Jack acknowledged and clipped the radio back into place, feeling a slight release of tension as the responsibility shifted. He was no longer alone with this knowledge. Whatever happened next would be handled by people with resources and authority equal to the task. The climb up the stairwell felt longer than the descent. The air grew warmer with each step, the cold receding reluctantly as the surface world reclaimed him. His muscles ached from tension rather than exertion, and his uniform felt heavier, damp with sweat that chilled him as temperatures shifted. When he reached the top, the glare of sunlight forced him to shield his eyes, the brightness almost painful after so long underground. He emerged into the lava field and immediately stepped away from the entrance, scanning the horizon in all directions. The landscape looked unchanged, the same black waves of stone, the same empty sky. And yet, everything felt different. The ground beneath his feet now concealed a hidden artery of activity, a secret that transformed the emptiness into something deceptive. Jack moved to a position of higher ground nearby, choosing a vantage point that allowed him to observe the entrance without being immediately visible. He used natural breaks in the basalt to mask his outline, settling into a watchful posture. From here, he could see the metal structure clearly, its warped edges catching the sun, its steps leading down into shadow. The waiting began. Minutes stretched into longer intervals as the sun climbed and the heat intensified. Jack drank sparingly from his canteen, conserving water as he maintained his watch. His attention never strayed far from the entrance, though he scanned the wider area regularly, alert for movement, dust plumes, or the distant glint of metal that might signal approaching vehicles. At one point, he thought he saw something at the edge of the field, a disturbance where the basalt met a stretch of sand. He raised his binoculars and focused, only to watch the shape dissolve into nothing more than heat shimmer and shifting light. Still, the possibility lingered. If the underground network had multiple access points, someone might appear anywhere, not just here. The radio crackled again, stronger this time. More instructions followed, confirming that specialized units were en route, that airspace was being monitored, that additional resources were being mobilized. Jack responded with updated observations, reporting no visible activity at the entrance and no confirmed movement in the surrounding area. As the hours passed, the initial surge of adrenaline faded, replaced by a deeper, steadier awareness. He replayed the descent in his mind, each tunnel and junction, each sign of modification and use. The image of the warehouse lingered most vividly, the rows of crates disappearing into darkness, the sense of scale that defied easy explanation. He knew that what he had glimpsed was likely only a portion of the whole, one node in a larger system designed to remain invisible. Eventually, distant sounds reached him from beyond the lava field, muted at first, then clearer. Vehicles. Multiple engines approaching along routes that had been planned and coordinated carefully to avoid drawing attention. Jack signaled his position and remained where he was, watching as the response he had set in motion began to arrive. He did not feel relief so much as gravity. The weight of what he had uncovered had not lifted. It had shifted, spreading outward to encompass everyone now involved. The lava field, silent and unforgiving, had guarded its secret for decades. Now that secret was exposed, and the consequences of that exposure were only beginning to unfold. Jack kept his eyes on the entrance until the first units reached him, his posture unchanged. He knew that from this moment forward, the discovery would no longer be just a story of an impossible structure in an impossible place. It would become an operation, a record, a case that would reach far beyond the desert and the man who happened to notice that nothing, here, was ever truly empty. The arrival of additional units did not bring noise or spectacle to the lava field. It brought order. Vehicles stopped at carefully chosen distances, their engines cut quickly, their outlines broken against the basalt, so they blended into the landscape rather than interrupting it. People moved with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to working where attention itself could be a liability. Jack Walker briefed them where he stood, his words precise, his memory steady. The underground routes replayed in his mind as if mapped there by repetition rather than a single descent. Specialists joined the perimeter within hours, their presence marked not by insignia or authority, but by the way they looked at the ground and the entrance. They did not react with surprise. They reacted with recognition. Their eyes lingered on the proportions of the steps, the angle of the railing remnants, the shape of the opening cut into the lava field. To them, this was not an impossibility, but an anomaly, with a lineage, something that could be placed within a larger context of forgotten ambition and abandoned infrastructure. As daylight waned and the heat softened, the first interpretations began to form. The materials, the construction methods, the surviving design cues all pointed toward an early era of large-scale engineering, a time when the boundaries between imagination and feasibility were tested aggressively. This was not a city project in the modern sense, but it bore the fingerprints of an age that believed transit could conquer geography through sheer resolve. Plans had once existed to carve routes through hostile terrain, to bind distant regions with rails and tunnels that ignored natural resistance rather than yielding to it. Records were pulled from archives that had not been accessed in years. Maps yellowed by time, technical drawings annotated by hands long gone, correspondence that spoke of optimism colliding with reality. The project that had birthed the underground station beneath the lava field had been conceived during a period of expansion and speculation, when railways and tunnels were proposed not only where people lived, but where they believed people might someday live. The desert in those documents was described not as empty, but as undeveloped, a semantic distinction that carried enormous implications. Construction had begun with confidence. Crews had poured concrete, laid foundations, and carved passages beneath ground thought to be stable enough to support them. The tiled station Jack had walked through had been part of a planned stop, a node in a network that was meant to grow outward over time. Its decorative elements were not indulgences. They were declarations. This was meant to be permanent. Then nature had intervened with indifference. Geological reports from the era described volcanic activity in cautious terms, downplaying risks that were poorly understood at the time. When lava finally moved through the region, it did so with a force and unpredictability that erased any remaining illusions of control. Surface structures were destroyed, access points were buried. The project was halted abruptly, not with ceremony or closure, but with evacuation and silence. Funding dried up as quickly as confidence had once flowed. The tunnels were sealed where possible and forgotten where they could not be reached. What remained beneath the hardened basalt was a fragment of ambition entombed by catastrophe. For decades, the underground structure lay untouched. The lava field above became a deterrent in its own right, a natural barrier that discouraged exploration. The absence of surface markers ensured that the station and its tunnels faded from collective memory. They were not demolished, not repurposed, not reclaimed. They simply ceased to exist in practical terms, surviving only as obscure references in files few ever read, until someone did. The question that followed was not whether the underground network could be found again, but how it had been found at all. That answer emerged gradually, pieced together from the same archives that documented the project's beginning. Old blueprints, once theoretical, revealed patterns when overlaid with modern satellite imagery. Where the surface showed nothing but stone, The subsurface told a different story to those who knew how to read it. The thickness of the basalt, the depth of the tunnels, the natural insulation provided by volcanic rock all pointed toward a feature that could be exploited rather than avoided. The lava field was not merely a grave for the project, it was a shield. The basalt above the tunnels absorbed heat and disrupted thermal readings, making the space beneath it difficult to detect using conventional surveillance methods. The isolation of the region reduced the likelihood of accidental discovery. The lack of infrastructure discouraged casual travel. To someone seeking concealment, the place was ideal. The specialist spoke carefully, aware that speculation had to be grounded in evidence. Still, the logic was difficult to ignore. Someone had rediscovered the old plans, recognized the potential, and invested in reviving the forgotten network selectively. They had not restored everything. They had chosen. Some tunnels were reopened and reinforced. Others were sealed permanently. The result was not a museum of history, but a functional system built atop an older skeleton. The underground warehouse Jack had glimpsed was the clearest indication of intent. Its scale suggested long-term use, not a temporary cache. Its organization implied logistics, planning, and coordination beyond a small group. Whatever moved through those tunnels was meant to remain unseen for as long as possible, and the people responsible had understood that concealment required patience as much as ingenuity. As the analysis deepened, the operation's potential reach became clearer. The tunnels did not exist in isolation. They connected to routes that could surface far from the lava field itself, possibly in regions where movement would blend into existing patterns of traffic. The underground network offered not just storage, but mobility, a way to shift materials beneath scrutiny and emerge where detection was least likely. For Jack, listening to these conclusions form around him was a strange experience. He had entered the lava field that morning as a ranger performing a routine patrol. Now he stood at the edge of a story that stretched backward through history and forward into uncertainty. The weight of it settled on him slowly, not as fear, but as a sobering awareness of scale. Individual actions had led him here, but the forces at play were far larger than any one person. The decision-making process accelerated as the picture sharpened. Authorities recognized that the underground network represented more than a localized threat. Its existence suggested planning that extended beyond regional boundaries, perhaps beyond national ones. The lava field, once dismissed as empty and inert, was recast as a strategic blind spot that had been exploited deliberately. Jack was instructed to step back from direct involvement as specialists prepared to enter the tunnels in force. He complied without hesitation. His role had been discovery, documentation, and restraint. Others would handle what came next. Still, he remained close enough to observe, his presence a quiet reminder of how the operation had begun. As preparations continued, he found his thoughts returning to the tiled station beneath the lava field, to the decorative choices made by builders who had never imagined their work would be repurposed in this way. Their ambition had been buried by lava, only to be unearthed decades later by people with very different intentions. The irony was not lost on him. The past, it seemed, had not stayed buried. It had waited. And now that it had been disturbed, the consequences would not remain confined to the tunnels below. Night settled over the lava field without ceremony, the heat of the day bleeding away until the black stone exhaled a brittle cold. The desert did not announce transitions, it simply changed state, as indifferent to human plans as it had been to the ambitions that once burrowed beneath it. Under portable lights positioned at careful distances, the entrance stood exposed for the last time, its warped metal edges catching pale illumination while the surrounding basalt swallowed everything else. Jack Walker watched from a ridge of broken rock as the perimeter tightened. Movement was controlled and quiet, the kind of discipline born not from urgency but from certainty. The discovery had passed fully into the hands of those trained to erase threats rather than merely observe them. Engineers, technicians, and security teams moved in practice coordination, their actions deliberate and restrained. The goal was not spectacle. The goal was finality. The first phase unfolded on the surface. Surveyors swept the surrounding lava field with instruments designed to find what the eye could not, tracing subtle voids beneath the stone, searching for anomalies that hinted at secondary access points. They moved slowly, marking and cross-checking, confirming what the historical analysis had already suggested. There were other passages, long sealed or deliberately collapsed, remnants of the original project that had never been fully reclaimed. Some were too deep or too compromised to pose immediate risk. Others had been altered, reinforced just enough to suggest potential use. Each was documented, assessed, and added to a growing map that rendered the invisible visible. Jack listened as conclusions formed around him, measured and unembellished. The network had been extensive once, then selectively resurrected. The warehouse he had seen was not an isolated chamber, but the hub of a system built to endure without attention. Its concealment relied not only on geology, but on neglect, on the assumption that nothing of value could exist where nothing was supposed to be. Once the perimeter was secured and the last surface checks completed, the focus shifted inward. Teams prepared to descend, their equipment stripped of anything unnecessary, their movements economical. Jack did not join them. He stood back, the distance between him and the entrance symbolic as much as practical. He had gone as far as he was meant to go. The descent began under controlled conditions, lights disappearing one by one down the stairwell as the underground reclaimed them. What followed unfolded mostly out of sight, filtered through updates and quiet exchanges over secure channels. The teams moved through the tunnels with caution, documenting, verifying, and neutralizing. The hum Jack remembered faded gradually as systems were powered down in sequence, the network's artificial breath slowing until it ceased altogether. When confirmation came that the warehouse had been fully secured, that its contents were cataloged and removed, the mood shifted again. This was no longer an operation of discovery or containment. It was preparation for erasure. The decision to collapse the entrance had not been made lightly. Alternatives had been considered, weighed against risk and practicality. Sealing the door was insufficient. The possibility of unknown routes, of future rediscovery, made half measures unacceptable. The structure beneath the lava field had existed once because people believed it should. It had been revived because someone else believed it could be used. Allowing it to remain accessible, even in fragments, meant accepting that belief again someday. Jack felt the weight of that decision more acutely than he expected. He understood the necessity, yet he could not shake the sense of finality that accompanied it. The tiled station, the silent platforms, the tunnels that stretched farther than they should, all of it would be lost again, this time by design. The final preparations took place at dawn. The sky lightened slowly, revealing the lava field in shades of charcoal and steel. Wind moved across the stone, lifting dust into brief spirals before scattering it away. The entrance stood unchanged, a scar in the landscape that would soon be closed. Charges were placed with precision, not to shatter the surface violently, but to collapse the internal structure in on itself. The goal was not destruction, but burial, a controlled implosion that would render the access unusable while preserving the illusion of undisturbed terrain above. Engineers double-checked calculations, adjusting for the unique properties of the basalt and the age of the concrete below. Jack watched as the last personnel cleared the area. A signal passed quietly, and the field fell still. The detonation was muted, almost anticlimactic. A deep, contained sound rippled through the ground, more felt than heard. The entrance sagged inward as the space beneath it gave way, metal folding and stone shifting until the opening collapsed into itself. Dust rose briefly, then settled, carried away by the wind until nothing remained but a shallow depression that quickly began to resemble the surrounding terrain. Where the stairs had descended into darkness, there was now only broken rock. Silence returned to the lava field, complete and absolute. The hum was gone. The cold air no longer rose from below. The desert reclaimed the space without hesitation, erasing the last visible trace of what had existed beneath it. Jack remained where he was long after the operation concluded. The teams withdrew methodically, their vehicles leaving no tracks that would last beyond the day. Equipment was packed, lights extinguished, and the perimeter dissolved as quietly as it had formed. By the time the sun climbed higher, the lava field looked as it always had, hostile and empty, offering no hint of the hidden artery that had once pulsed beneath it. He descended from the ridge and walked to the edge of the collapsed site. The ground was warm already, absorbing the morning light. He crouched and brushed a thin layer of dust aside, finding nothing beneath but stone. The entrance was gone, not sealed, not concealed, but erased. A strange sense of loss settled over him, unexpected and unwelcome. He had not come here seeking history, yet he felt its absence now. The underground station had been a relic of a different kind of faith, one that believed permanence could be engineered into the world. Its second life had twisted that faith into something darker, something that required it to be removed entirely. Jack straightened and looked out across the lava field. The horizon wavered in the rising heat, the black stone stretching endlessly in all directions. It was easy now to believe that nothing lay beneath it, that the land was exactly what it appeared to be. He knew better. As he turned to leave, his gaze caught on a small detail near his boot, half buried in dust. He knelt again and lifted it carefully. It was a fragment of metal, no larger than a coin, its surface marked by a faint, unfamiliar symbol. It had likely been dislodged during the collapse, ejected briefly before settling back into the field. It meant nothing on its own. It was not evidence, not a clue that could reopen what had been closed. And yet, holding it, Jack felt the same unease he had felt when he first noticed the impossible shape rising from the sand. A reminder that structures could be buried, networks dismantled, entrances erased, but the ideas that created them were harder to destroy. He placed the fragment back where he had found it and let the dust cover it again. Some things were better left to the desert. Jack Walker left the lava field as he had entered it, alone and unobserved, his presence swallowed quickly by distance. Behind him, the ground lay silent and unchanged, a vast expanse of frozen violence hiding no secrets, at least for now. The darkness beneath had been sealed, its roots collapsed, its purpose ended. But, as the wind moved across the stone and the sun climbed higher, the lava field gave no sign that it would. If this story kept you watching until the end, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More hidden discoveries, forgotten places, and real stories are already waiting for you in our other videos. Watch the next story now. Explore the rest of the channel and share this video with someone who loves mysteries buried in plain sight.